This is the story of the Chinese language, a language with an iconic look that you see the world over. But what you don't see is the perilous journey that this language had to go through to get where it is today. I'm talking dragon bones, tigers, and very big bonfires. And I'll tell you right now, the danger might not be over. If you like survival stories, this one is for you, starting with a very narrow escape. In the late 19th century, some villagers from Henan province were digging fields when they discovered some bones, which they assumed were obviously dragon bones. Just imagine that moment. And what do you do with dragon bones? Well, obviously you grind them up and use them as medicine, of course. There were lots and lots of them, and as fast as the dragon bones were dug up, they were crushed, sold, and ingested or rubbed into knife wounds. Thank goodness a collector named Wang realised that bones had ancient inscriptions on them, or we'd have none left to tell us what they said. So what did those ancient inscriptions say? In ancient times, kings would seek answers through divination, that is, sending questions to the spirit world. Important questions such as, would the king's hunt be successful, or which dead uncle was causing the king's toothache? So a statement would be inscribed onto a tortoise shell or ox scapula, something hopeful like, in the next 10 days, there will be no disasters. Then a hot poker was pressed into the bone, making it crack. The king would then look at the shape of the cracks for hidden meaning. That is, an affirmative or negative response from the spirits. I'd love to know what the question about a tiger was. I mean, how cool is this pictogram right here? What do you think? Does it look like the Chinese writing you see today? There are a lot of these, but more on the pictograms later. They called these bones oracle bones, and the symbols that people wrote on them eventually became a recognizable Chinese script. It was such a common practice that we found tens of thousands of oracle bones telling us how people used to write. Truly our earliest example of Chinese writing. Pretty cool, right? But there is a deeper layer to this. The pictograms were actually remarkably well developed, not just primitive pictures like a child's animal art, but a proper writing system. And that means that people had already been writing for hundreds of years prior to the bone inscriptions. Perhaps this awesome discovery made up for the catastrophic language massacre that happened in 213 BC. But before we get to that, what came after the oracle bones? Most ancient Chinese writing that survived is on bronze artifacts like this. The writing on these is a lot finer than on the bones. But Chinese also had its version of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are bamboo slips with ancient writing on them that were only unearthed in the 1990s and 2000s. We'll see how they wrote on bamboo later and how bamboo could be the reason for the Chinese script being written vertically. But really, Chinese has had many scripts over the centuries and undergone a huge transformation. Did you know that you can even write Chinese characters in cursive? Now, remember the tiger character that we saw earlier? He is a good example of how often Chinese characters changed over the years. Just have a look at this. But now, about that catastrophic language massacre. The first emperor of China was a paranoid, ruthless tyrant who buried anyone who disagreed with him. But of course, it's not just people who can disagree with you. History books can also disagree with you. And as soon as he figured that out, he also burned most of the books. Yep, including Confucian classics and ancient poetry books. Anyone refusing to comply was banished to the north to work on building the Great Wall. Huge records of the past, up in smoke. But not to worry, Qin simply rewrote his own history books. Anyway, what he lacked in humility, he made up for in resourcefulness, I suppose. Qin simplified and unified the written Chinese language, which ultimately led to the standardized writing that we use today. And you're going to see just how logical the script is in a bit. Here's a little teaser. But to pull it all together, I should first explain the spoken language and why we call it Mandarin Chinese, which, by the way, sounds a little bit like this.
嗨，大家好，我叫陈婉瑜，然后我是生在中国吉林长春。
So anyway, what do we know about spoken Chinese? Well, I think I'm going to need some help for this one.
Okay, so during the Zhou dynasty, which was over 1,000 years BC, this is when we have 古汉语, or what we call ancient Chinese or old Chinese. Now, it sounded very, very different to what we know as Chinese today. The sound system had a lot of rough sounds, clusters, and a lot of breathing. Actually, if you listen to Tibetan today, you hear a lot of these clustery kinds of sounds. It wasn't a lot unlike that. This old Chinese didn't have tones either as we know them today. In English, when you think of tones, many people just think of pitch, but these are actually all throat actions. And so what the throat was doing at the ends of these words, and sometimes at the beginning, was setting up for what we know as tones today. But how do we know what they sounded like? Because even if you look at Chinese today, there's no actual phonetic transcription built in there. Or is there? So even when we look at modern characters, we'll see a portion of the character that's actually a pronunciation guide. It's giving us a hint to what the pronunciation was. Now, back in Old Chinese, these would have been more accurate because so much has changed since then. And so using poetry, there once was a man from Nantucket. What rhymes with that? Don't answer. They were able to start to piece these together and see which words rhymed with which words, which common sound components were between words. So through using poetry and some pretty tricky detective work, to today, we can see reconstructions of these old Chinese words.
We could really get into how they did that if you want, but that will have to be another video. So if you want to hear about that one, then you better like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to this channel too so that you don't miss it. Now, in a moment, you're going to practice writing a character, a Chinese character. So I hope you have a pen, and don't worry, we will not be doing this one, the hardest character of them all. Did you count those strokes? Seriously? Anyway, many different dialects of the language started emerging around this time. China is massive. It's mountainous, and there were so many wars going on, and for these reasons, this is how often dialects are actually born. At this stage, writing was still in pictograms, but it was getting rather artistic, with many special scripts being invented for decorative engraving and seals, especially on weapons like this sword. These seal scripts were beautiful and got curious names like bird script and worm script. They're an ancient style of Chinese calligraphy, but not everyone got to be an artist. Writing was reserved for the wealthy and the scholars. You're not surprised, are you? This was already a land of significant social control, and they were only just getting started. And speaking of getting started, if you want to get started learning Mandarin, we have recently released a story learning Mandarin course so that you can learn Chinese through the magic of stories. I'll tell you about that later on in the video. Jumping ahead now to the 7th to 10th centuries AD, the language now used was Middle Chinese. During these years, the writing system got a lot more complex, and people started writing a vernacular Chinese to reflect the spoken language. A phonetic system developed, which we know about partly thanks to something called rhyme tables. These were dictionaries of sorts that showed you how to pronounce Chinese characters. Some Buddhist monks came up with this idea. Nice one. It does sound like even Chinese people needed help with Chinese, which might make you feel a little bit better about learning it. Back to social control. In the 17th century, the empire actually tried to standardize pronunciation of Chinese in such a massive country. I don't know how they never saw a complete failure coming. But anyway, Middle Chinese is the ancestor of almost all the modern dialects that we have today.
So looking at a map of China here, we can see all of this portion here is what we call the north. Okay, so this whole section here is the north. We call that Bei, and the Chinese that was spoken there is what we would call Guanhua. So that is what we know today as Mandarin. Now, Mandarin, that doesn't sound like a very Chinese word, does it? So we know for over 3,000 years, many of the regimes had their capitals in the north, in Beijing. And so this became the lingua franca for anything official done. And so that's actually what this character Guan would have meant. Guanhua was more like the official language. And so this was basically representing the northern dialects. And so anybody from anywhere in China, if they wanted to do anything official, they would come back to Guanhua, the Mandarin language. Now, why is it called Mandarin? You may know, if you've done any yoga, the word mantra, and we use a mantra in English. Mantra actually comes from the Sanskrit word. This is a mantra, so mantra, and it's basically what we know as a mantra, a saying or official language, or any very formal language that's cast down or put down or said out there. And so mantra was this official language. And if I add an I, now in Sanskrit, this is how we write an I, so we turn this into mantri, is the person. So this meant basically official, an official, a government official. So this was the language of the officials. Now, in Sanskrit, if I wanted to make it the thing that is, the actual instrument of it, I add an N. So that becomes Mandarin. So if you speak Indonesian or Malay, you would know that you have the word menteri, or in Thai you have montri, and this means a government minister too, coming from the Sanskrit. Well, wait a minute. Why did that get used for Chinese? Well, it actually came via Portuguese. And so the Portuguese in Malacca back in the 1500s, 1600s, there was a lot of influence there, both of Portuguese into Malay and Malay into Portuguese. And so Mandarin became Mandrim, and that's where we get Mandarin from to today. So basically, the official language, or the language of the officials, was translated as Mandarin or Mandarin as we know it now in English.
Okay, so what do we have by this point? We have one national language, hundreds of regional dialects and other languages, and a single writing system that can be pronounced in many different ways. Thing is, only 20% of the population were literate until something happened to change that, a little thing called the Communist Revolution in 1949. This was the beginning of the People's Republic era. The People's Republic wanted China to be one thing, one language, one country, one time zone. Quite a challenge when you look at the size of the place. I mean, it spans 5 time zones. Anyway, the government went on a big mission to make people more literate. So they simplified the Chinese characters, making them easier to learn, read, and write. One guy who opposed these reforms was sent to a labor camp in central China, and many others were not happy to lose the artistry of the old script. I mean, look at this word, for example, the original word for listen. When it became simplified, it lost all of its meaningful parts. But I suppose the test is actually whether or not literacy improved as a result of these changes, right? So did it work? Did simplifying Chinese characters make people more literate? Well, there is a massive debate around this, but the basic arguments go like this. There was indeed an explosion in literacy in China after the simplification of characters. However, traditionalists will say that this explosion wasn't due to the simplification of the script, but rather down to the state-sponsored education system having that effect on literacy. Perhaps more compellingly, Hong Kong and Taiwan stuck with traditional Chinese characters, and they have far higher literacy rates now. Having said that, mainland China is a far bigger place, which is clearly going to make it harder to achieve uniform literacy, and that's the main argument of the supporters of the simplification. Me personally, well, I have absolutely no idea, but there's a good summary of the whole debate for and against traditional characters on Wikipedia. Nowadays, written Chinese functions as a lingua franca of sorts, and it's pretty amazing that all these people speaking so many different dialects and languages can all read and write with the one same writing system. Funny thing is, some people find that simplified writing makes the characters harder to learn, not easier, because there are fewer visual cues. My Chinese friends, and those of you who know both traditional and simplified characters, let me know in the comments your views on this, and keep it clean.
So if you're freaking out about learning 50,000 characters before you can even write Chinese, don't worry. There's actually only around 214 components to Chinese characters as we use them today. And once you start to get the hang of it, there's actually a very beautiful logic to it, to the point that you can make some really close guesstimables, even if you've never seen a character, as to how it sounds, or it's probably going to sound, and as to what it means. Let me show you. You have a total of 6 different types of characters, the way characters are put together. But let me just look at this one. So if I've got something here, that's the sun shining, okay? And so this became the character for sun. Notice the order that I do it. Order of strokes is actually quite important, and you can often tell foreigners, they will do it just as they see it, but you can tell stroke order almost like somebody's accent, and it will have an effect on the intelligibility of your characters. So anyway, that's the word for sun, or the character for sun. Then we have the moon like this, and so moon went down like that, and then became this. And so this character here, yue, means moon. So this is what we call a pictogram. That's a 象形字, the characters that actually look like the things they are. Other ones would be maybe mountain. And so you have this picture of the mountain, and you can actually see the peaks of the mountain there. So they look like what they are. Very similar to that for very basic meanings. So for example, this is the word 上, which means over. Have a guess what that means? The opposite, 下, meaning under. So these are what we call simple ideograms, or 指示字. 指示 means to indicate, so they indicate the meaning. So these are very simple concepts, but actually these only make up around 4% of the character base in Chinese. What happens then is that you start putting these together. So we saw just now that this means sun. The sun is bright, the moon is bright, and so this character then was used to mean bright. Now the way to say it in modern Chinese, Ming, means bright. But then we can use that metaphorically. Bright, clear, anything that's bright and clear, that can be a component of a word. So for example, this is the word for white, and you can see it's the sun. The sun is bright, it's white, with this stroke coming out. So Ming Bai. So bai is white, Ming Bai, which means basically as clear as the sun, as bright as day, which means to understand. Kind of get it. It's as clear as day. I understand. 明白. Like another example, this is a woman. And so many people would say this was a beautiful lady, a maiden sitting down with her legs crossed. And so 女 is woman. And then this was a horse. Now, if you have a look at the original character, this was a horse with its mane flapping in the breeze as it was galloping around. And so the pronunciation of this was ma. And so the thing that had to do with women that sounds like ma means mother. And so this character, ma, is the Chinese character for mother. You can see I have a meaning component, female, and then I have the sound component, ma, or in this case, ma, meaning mother. And so that's what we get here. Number 5 is 形声字. They are phonosemantic compounds. This is when you get a sound compound mixed with a meaning compound, and it gives us a pretty good idea of what those words mean and sound like. For me, this logic is just mind-blowing, and as you start reading, you see these neurons start firing that you've never felt before as you're learning Chinese. This, if not anything else, is amazing impetus to go and learn Chinese. Reading Chinese is just one big mind buzz.
Okay, got that pen ready? There is a specific stroke order you have to follow when writing. Go on, give it a try. See how duplicating the word tree makes it forest? Makes perfect logical sense, right? And by the way, this is one of the characters that is amazingly similar to its original form on the oracle bones. Now, what about that vertical writing that we've all seen? Chinese used to be written from right to left and in vertical columns. And the reason is really simple. In ancient times, when people wrote on bamboo strips, it was a hell of a lot easier to write vertically. This is a modern bamboo book, but you can see what I mean. Makes a lot of sense now, right? The bamboo books were rolled up into a scroll, so it was also easier to write with your ink brush in your right hand while continually unrolling the scroll with your left hand. I mean, the other way around would have just been awkward. Try it out and you'll see what I mean. Unless, of course, you, like me, you are left-handed and you are used to basically nothing in the world being made for you. Chinese has only been written horizontally since the Communist Revolution of 1949. All newspapers in China changed from vertical to horizontal alignment on the 1st of January 1956. But really, you can write your Chinese whichever way you want, even with the old ABC. You've probably heard that you can also write Chinese characters using the Roman alphabet, which is a crucial bridge to help learners with pronunciation. Interestingly, the guy who created Pinyin is quite a legend. He only died a few years ago at age 111. The president who commissioned him to create Pinyin was Mao himself, who, wait for it, later sent him to a labor camp for 2 years. If Mao had had his way, Chinese characters would have been completely eliminated. But luckily, a certain chap named Joseph Stalin talked him out of it. That's right, Stalin. And if that isn't a little piece of fascinating history, then I don't know what is.
So as far as grammar is concerned, for English speakers, there are some things that are super easy. For example, Chinese in general is a subject-verb-object language. So, 我, I love, 你, you. So, 我爱你, I love you. Or something a little more complex, 我, I, 想, would like to, desire to, 回, to return, 家, 我想回家, I want to go home. I want to return home. So the structure of most sentences actually are pretty much in line with what you would expect from English. No real surprises there. Moreover, there are no verb conjugations, no tenses, no gender-specific nouns like you may have a male table or a feminine chair. None of that happen in Chinese. So far, so good, right? Now, the rub starts to happen, especially with Westerners, when it comes to what we call in English tones. So when most foreigners think of tones, they think of pitch. So in Mandarin Chinese, there are 4+1 tones. So those 4 tones are, now if you imagine this is a graph, this is like 1 to 5. Ah, lowest part of my voice, ah, highest part of my voice. Now it's not actual pitch, it's just your general register. Don't worry about the actual frequency of the pitch. It's all about what your throat's doing. So the word for mother, ma, ma, that's in the top part of my voice and it's not wavering. This is for Mandarin. Ma, ma, this means hemp. And so this is going from about a 2 to a 5. Ma, you see it's got a dip. Ma, this is modern Mandarin. That means a horse. And then ma, 5 to 2 maybe, to scold somebody. Ma. And then you've got this neutral word here, ma, which is a question ending. It's a speech particle. But you can see here, ma, 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 ma. This neutral tone. So 1, 2, 3, 4 tones and a neutral tone. Tones are actually an amazingly beautiful thing within the language, and there's this beautiful, easy logic to them as to why they're there and how to reproduce them. I'll give you a hint. The key is not in just focusing on the pitch. So don't let anybody ever convince you that tones are tricky.
Okay, Standard Chinese or Modern Standard Mandarin has 921.2 million native speakers and is an official language of mainland China, Taiwan, Singapore and the UN. In China, it's spoken by about 70% of the population. Cantonese, which is native to Hong Kong and Macau, is the most well-known Chinese language that's not mutually intelligible with Mandarin. And of course, Taiwanese Mandarin is the official language in Taiwan, and Chinese is also spoken in Tibet, Indonesia, Peninsular Malaysia, and Thailand. As you know, there is a huge Chinese population living all over the planet, but especially in the US, Australia, South Africa, Southeast Asia, and New Zealand. The reason? Well, from the 19th century up until 1949, there was mass immigration out of China, mainly caused by corruption, starvation, and war. In the US, Chinese is the third most spoken language after English and Spanish. Can you believe that? Although if you are learning Chinese, don't get too excited unless you're also learning Cantonese, because you're just as likely to come across Cantonese as Mandarin in the US. So then, why learn Chinese?
There are so many reasons to learn Chinese. So I'm going to share with you maybe 4 of my top reasons why I would want to learn Chinese if I didn't already speak it. 1, wherever you go on this planet, you're probably going to run into Chinese speakers somewhere. I'll give you an example. When I got married several years back, my wife and I, we got married in France and we had our honeymoon across Europe. We were having breakfast downstairs at that hotel, and there were employees working the breakfast area in that hotel that were from several Southeast Asian countries. Now, when they spoke together, I heard they were actually speaking in Mandarin. Mandarin wasn't their mother tongue, and so I started speaking to them, and I learned a whole lot about not only the hotel, but that whole area, and even those different communities that lived in the city there from Southeast Asia, which for me was fascinating. So for me, I find Chinese is a lingua franca in many places around the world for many people who have come from countries that are not maybe China, but they could have Chinese populations in there, or they may have had some incentive to learn Chinese. And that wasn't just a one-off. North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, right across Asia. Heck, even in Fiji, there is a Chinese-speaking population there that can enrich your life. And that leads me into point number 2. With every language that I speak, imagine then how many new opportunities are opened up to happen in my life. Opportunities are opened up by people. And if I go back and look at my life, ever since I was a kid, I see that everything that I am today, every experience that I've had is actually due to the languages that I speak. And very few of those opportunities for me happened by means of English. Most of them have happened through people that I met through speaking languages other than English. So just imagine now, with almost 2 billion Chinese speakers around the world, how many more new opportunities may be opened up to you that never would have been a thing if you didn't speak Chinese. My third reason would be you actually get to know what's really going on without having to have that information filtered by any other people. So whether it's news, whether you're in a company, and many expats in countries may only have their secretary or their HR director to translate for them, or if you're going for a meeting in China with a client, very often you're given an interpreter. And let me tell you, in this part of the world, loyalty is earned. And so if you have an interpreter, they don't have loyalty to you. They don't need to tell you everything that's going on. And if they hear something that might make their country look bad or them look bad, or they might feel embarrassed, well, they're probably going to filter it for your ears. For me, I like to know what's really going on. I want to know what's going on in social media, current events, what people are really saying, not what pundits are telling me they're saying. And so through speaking Chinese, I get to hear a lot of things from the horse's mouths. I'm able to read documents straight from the source that don't get filtered or altered or some kind of spin put on them by third parties. And finally, in learning Chinese, and here I'm meaning Chinese not just as Mandarin Chinese, but Chinese as this greater beast. Whether it's Mandarin or any of the other dialects, think of it as a gateway drug into many, many other languages. The amazing Pinyin system for breaking down sounds into a map of the mouth, this was based on Sanskrit, but in understanding that, you can start to understand how sounds shift, how dialects change. And so through understanding that, which you'll get through any entry point into Chinese via Mandarin, via Cantonese, you're going to start to understand how sounds shift. If you travel 200 kilometers from one city to another, you can hear the differences in speech. You're going to understand how this system is working, and then you can actually understand these shifts, and you can start to even predict what words are going to sound like depending on where they are geographically and what's happened historically. You might be learning Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Thai. You'll be amazed how many links there are as long as you understand some simple principles that are part and parcel of the Chinese language system that you can then apply to other languages. So for me, Chinese is almost like a gateway drug into many, many other languages, both within China and outside of China. And for me, that's just awesome.
Chinese is endlessly fascinating, and that's why we recently added Chinese to our lineup of story learning courses. So if you like the idea of learning Chinese and you'd like to try learning Chinese through stories, well, this could be for you. Chinese Uncovered is a complete language course that takes you from absolute beginner in Mandarin Chinese all the way through to intermediate level using the magic of story. There is a link in the description for more information. Story learning is a method that I developed myself to help complete beginners learn a new language with stories. And the aim is to teach you to think in the new language, just in the same way that you learn to speak as a child. That's what stories allow you to do. We also have a fantastic community of other people learning Chinese, so it's an opportunity for you to really explore this wonderful culture with others while learning to speak the language. There is a free 7-day trial available, and it is an awful lot of fun. So look for the link below in the description and give it a shot.